If you recognize the name James Comey, it is probably because of his stint as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What you may not know is that that has not been his only career. Before he led the Bureau, Comey served in the office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1987 to 1993. While there, he helped prosecute the mob. Now he has become a novelist. His first work of fiction, Central Park West, is inspired by some of the experience he had back in his days with the U.S. Attorney's Office. It is a gripping read. Once it got its hooks into us, we had a hard time setting it down. We both really encourage you to give it a chance.
We enjoyed getting the chance to speak with Jim Comey. In this interview, we cover, among other things, mob hits, the survival advice the FBI gives high-profile targets, the so-called rules of the Mafia, the challenges of prosecuting organized crime, and the man Jim Comey considers to have been the best mob investigator ever. My name is Áine Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is a conversation with James Comey, Central Park West, mob hits, and mafia myths. I actually have a bit of history with Jim Comey. He attended the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is also my alma mater. While there, he was a contributor to the student newspaper, The Flat Hat. Years later, when I was a student there, I was the editor of that paper, and it was a huge part of my time at the college. I actually got the chance to interview him when I was a student. An alumnus told me that the FBI director had written for The Flat Hat. I thought it would be a very cool interview, and for some reason he agreed to talk to me. A few years later, we met again when I interviewed him for an alumni event in Washington, D.C. So we started out this conversation with a reference to those earlier talks. Hey!
Hey, Áine, how are you?
Good, how are you? It's so nice to talk to you again.
Same. I keep chasing you around. I'm sorry.
I know, right? I can't get rid of you. It's a William and Mary Virginian. Well, this is my husband and podcasting partner, Kevin.
It's nice to meet you, sir.
He's talking to you for the first time, so he's not a veteran like me.
It's great to meet you. Great to meet you.
But we're both super excited to talk to you. First of all, just wanted to say we love this book.
Good.
It was really great.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
It brought back some really fond memories for me because I used to work at Insider, which is in the financial district. So I was in that area and I kept on being like, I worked here to him. But it was really terrific. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So you all are in Indianapolis now?
That's correct. Yes.
Great place.
Yeah, love it here. Moved from the East Coast to the Midwest, so we're having a good time.
I have a lot of relatives in that area, so
really in the
been there a lot.
Oh,
Indianapolis, around Indy, and then in weird small towns, and then obviously around the university.
since we do a true crime podcast, we spend a lot of time in weird small town Indiana for sure.
Yeah.
So we've gotten very familiar with that.
Yeah, I had one of my cousins lives in Batesville, which is famous for its casket company.
We got to check that out.
Anyhow, I'll stop that.
All right. So you have so much experience with law enforcement. You've been FBI director, you've been U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, private practice. What made you decide to write a novel on a mob prosecution?
Well, the decision to write a novel at all came after nudging from the editor on my second nonfiction book, who kept referring to the things I was writing about my actual cases. He would call them scenes, and I would correct him and say, "It's not a scene, dude. That's my life. That happened." And he would say, "Yeah, but you write stories well. You ought to think about fiction." So long story short, a lot of nudging led me to try it, and I'm so glad that I did. And the idea for the story came from my amazing William and Mary graduate wife, Patrice, who said, "Hey, what about, you were a mob prosecutor in New York." And she knew my background, obviously, because we were married the whole time. And she said, "Your daughter, also a William and Mary graduate, is now working in the violent and organized crime unit in the Southern District of New York. What about a story like this?" And she sketched it out, and we talked about it, and then fleshed it out fully, and I set to work writing. So the inspiration for the story comes from Patrice.
Why do you think organized crime continues to fascinate us in fiction and nonfiction? And I mean, it seems like Americans can't really get enough of those kinds of stories.
I'm not sure exactly. You all probably know as good an answer as I have, but I think part of it is that with organized crime, especially the Italian mafia in America, life imitated art in a really odd way. And what I mean by that is The Godfather was the seminal movie. It came out at a time when no new members were being made in organized crime, the mafia in America. And I remember talking to mafia witnesses who said that movie shaped their understanding of the way it is and the way it should be, because they couldn't get on the inside. They were young criminals trying to be part of the mob. And Sammy the Bull Gravano once told me he remembered exactly where he was the first time he saw this. And he walked out from the theater and thought, "That's the life. That's the way I want to live." Now, the mob wasn't really like that. It was similar, but the movie glorified it in all kinds of ways, introduced this concept of honor, which was nonsense. And so these young members became the people who led the mafia, and they followed the art. I think that's true with the broader culture as well. The movie depictions were so interesting, so enthralling for audiences, that it stoked an interest in both the mob and in the good people of the United States in a way.
Yeah, people who watched movies like The Godfather often tend to think that there are period pieces and that organized crime no longer exists. Is that an accurate assessment of things?
It is not. And the public attention to organized crime tends to ebb and flow, driven by particular cases or particular crimes that draw the public attention. But organized crime is there, involving a lot of different ethnic groups that come to the United States and lots of native-born Americans whose families have been here for generations. But it exists because it's a way for bad people to make a lot of money. Organized criminals tend to make more money, have a greater sense of identity than disorganized criminals. I remember commenting sarcastically, I didn't mean this, when I became a federal prosecutor in Richmond, that what we needed was more organization to our crime in Richmond, because it was so chaotic that there was all kinds of random crime and random violence that an organized criminal enterprise wouldn't tolerate. So I was kidding, but there are street gangs and all kinds of organized criminal groups all over the United States. And our focus on them as citizens and law enforcement tends to ebb and flow, but they're still there because it makes too much sense.
You mentioned that some of the myths spread by Hollywood about organized crime, specifically the mafia, are kind of nonsense when you actually start looking into it. And the book gets a lot into this, like the code of honor, the alleged code of honor that some of these groups have. And can you speak more to that, about some of the misconceptions put out there about organized crime by fiction?
Yeah, fiction and members themselves have long propagated myths that these are people who, although they're criminals, are people who are honorable in a way. They have a set of rules. For example, There was a rule against drug trafficking in the American Mafia, a rule against harming law enforcement, which was actually my favorite rule, a rule against sleeping with another mate, because again, these are patriarchal organizations. So there was a rule against sleeping with another MAID member's wife, a rule against lying to other MAID members unless it is to lure them to their death, which always struck me as a rule that wasn't all that reassuring. You're telling me the truth unless you're about to kill me. And as a friend of mine said to a jury in a case we tried together, he said, this stuff is like the rule against fighting in hockey, right? It's on the books, they talk about it, but if you go to a hockey game, all you're seeing are people dropping gloves and swinging fists at each other. And so all of us as humans seek sources of identity and meaning. In Cosa Nostra, they seek identity and meaning in this idea that we are people of honor. There are rules. Now, the truth is the rules are not obeyed. They're just talked about.
I'd like to jump back to the novel. It's a really gripping, enthralling read, very well written and constructed. And it doesn't read like a first novel, but it is your first novel. So I'm just curious, how did you go about plotting it, constructing it, and writing it?
I have always thought in stories. And from my youngest memories, I was someone who would go to school and then watch the people around me and listen to the way they talked, and then go home and tell the stories about it to my family. And that was true when I was doing mob cases in New York. And so I've always had an ability to imagine a story and to tell it, I hope, in an interesting way. Where I needed help and got it from Patrice was I haven't read a lot of fiction. I've been a nonfiction person most of my career. When I was in government, I found it really hard to read crime fiction or terrorism-related fiction or espionage. But Patrice has read it all, and she had an ability to visualize an entire story, imagined story. So my gift was something happened, and I could tell about it in an interesting way. What she could give this enterprise is making up a story, telling it to me, and then I could go off and write it. And so that's the way we worked. And the trick was imagining the entire story, then figuring out what scenes will add up to that story, and what should we show the reader and when, and how do we keep it interesting, suspenseful, but not have a reader at the end. This is always one of Patrice's pet peeves about fiction. She said, when you feel cheated by the author, that I could have figured it out if they had just showed me that thing that they hid until the very end. And so doing that was an iterative process where she read a Google Doc. I did the writing. If she were here, she would say, look, I am not a writer. I would do the writing, and she would read a Google Doc at night and give me those little comments, those little bubbles on the side that says, okay, this is good, or this doesn't make sense, or you should think about moving this to another place. Then I'd get to work the next day, and that would just happen day after day.
That's incredible. It sounds like she was your assignment editor.
She to flash back to our journalism days in college. Yes, she was. And she also helped me keep the voices right. One of the things I discovered is difficult when you imagine people. Now, the key characters are inspired by people that I knew or know, but I had a tendency for the voices to drift as I wrote drafts, where people started to sound like each other. And Patrice was able to see that and say, no. Benny, who's a key character, is starting to sound like this character, and you need to keep Benny on track. And so I'd go back and work on it again.
Yeah, I have some questions a bit later to ask about Benny. But first, you mentioned your wife's contributions to this. And that's interesting because reading this story, it really felt like one theme that kept on coming up in different ways was family, whether it's the work family or it's the family, the literal children of some of the main characters, or even the Mafia family itself. Were you trying to write something here about family and what it means in life?
Yes, that's a great pickup. I'm so glad that you saw that. I hope other people see it. Family is the center of my life. It's the source of my identity. I've had all kinds of weird jobs for random reasons, and I've lost some of them precipitously, but it's not who I am. I mean, who I am is a spouse, a father, now a grandfather. That's the source of my identity. And Patrice has training as a marriage and family therapist. And so talking about family, trying to help families. The work she's done with foster children is all about families of choice and putting them together. So yes, that's a huge part of who I am. And so we wanted it to be part of this story, both because that's fun for me to write that, and also I hope useful to people.
Absolutely. The murder sheet keeps us busy. At one recent court hearing, we were running around observing, gathering information, and reporting from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. Because of all that, it's hard to find time to secure quality ingredients and cook fine meals at home.
Thankfully, HelloFresh has our backs. Our terrific sponsor is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. This service combines convenience, value, and deliciousness, and ensures that you and your family are enjoying home-cooked, quality meals without the hassle.
Recently, Kevin and I got to put our heads together over something other than script writing. It was so fun to cook together. It was also quite easy. The ingredients are perfectly portioned, so there's no food waste. The instructions are also foolproof, which is lucky for us because we are fools in the kitchen.
We prepared beef bulgogi meatballs with roasted carrots, ginger rice, and sriracha sauce. It was delicious. The meatballs were flavorful and the rice was perfectly fluffy.
We're pretty used to just grabbing cheap fast food when we're on the road, so some nutritional heft and diversity of cuisine has been really nice. You never have to worry about getting tired of anything, because there's something for everyone. Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. And were there any, I'm just curious, you mentioned that you're more of the nonfiction person and Patrice is more of the fiction person. Do you have a sense of what her sort of thoughts were around what sort of fiction authors she was sort of drawing inspiration from when she's thinking about story and helping you craft it together?
Not names, but she would tell me the things that drive her crazy. So thank goodness I can't associate a name with that criticism, and the things she liked. But again, the things that drove her crazy were when they tricked the reader. She said she enjoys the pleasure of looking back at a book at the end and saying, it was there. They were fair to me. I just didn't understand the breadcrumbs in the right way, and that's kind of cool. She liked characters that were rich enough that people could think about them when they weren't reading. And so that was one of my goals, to have these characters be people that stay with you a little bit. And then, well, I'll probably have a fight with my editor about this, but she's long been a fan of trilogies that end. And so our conception, I'm nervous about this whole project because I want to do this for a living, but our conception is that we'll do 3 New York-based books. Then we'd like to do 3 books based in DC. Actually, I'd like to do 3 based in Virginia around Richmond, Williamsburg, and have a separate set of characters. So it's not the same characters just dealing with new challenges over and over and over again. And maybe down the road, if this really works, we can have characters overlap. But these are the things she drew from so much of her reading. And she also wanted, which is something that I was trained to do as a journalist in college, clear writing, simple writing that you can digest very, very quickly. And those are probably the 3 buckets of things I remember her talking about.
I'm curious, we've talked in the past with Scott Turow, whose work background is not completely dissimilar from yours. Is there an element of storytelling in the law job when you have to take a complicated case and present it to a jury? And does that transfer to novel writing?
Yeah, yes. I listened to your podcast with Scott Turow, who I've never met, but I'm going to meet in a book event in Chicago in the first week of June and tell him in a way this is sort of his fault, because I read Presumed Innocent when it came out in 1987. I was about to become a federal prosecutor, and that book lit me on fire. I just thought, this is the coolest thing. This is what I'm going to get to do. And then I couldn't get back to fiction for another 30 years. But I remember that one so clearly. So hats off to Scott Turow. And I'm nervous and excited about meeting him. But yeah, I think all good lawyering is storytelling. And it's not just about being a litigator. If you're a real estate lawyer or a lawyer having people understand what their estate might look like when they die, it's about gathering facts communicating them to a client in a way that holds their interest, that talks about the most important things first, that, again, doesn't wander, isn't boring, is entertaining in a way. Those are the great lawyers. Those are the great journalists. You spend a ton of time as a journalist trying to figure out what should be in that first paragraph, in that lead. How do I hold their interest and tell the story in a good way? So all good lawyers are storytellers. And of course, litigators, which I've been a lot of my life, are literal storytellers trying to have a judge or a jury understand the narrative spine of a case that you're going to present. And again, it seems lawyers are often crappy storytellers because we're such a, let me not use a negative word, I was going to say arrogant. We're such an often proud group that we see the tricks of communication as beneath us, right? That thinking about what my sentences look like, or thinking about the tone of my voice or the pace or the volume is beneath me. No, it's not. That I can remember as a law clerk for a federal judge reading stacks and stacks of briefs, including from big law firms, and most of them were awful. There was a brief that I remember still today, and I'm about to quote to you from a sentence in that brief because it was responding to an opponent who had made a bunch of different arguments. And in their final response to the final argument, they said, "This argument is the proverbial 13th stroke of the clock, suspicious in itself and casting doubt on all that went before." And I read that at my desk. I thought, oh my God. I jumped up holding the brief. I ran into the judge's private office and I said, "You got to read this." And I showed it to him. And I have never found an occasion to work that line in. And I'm not giving up yet. But so what just happened there? The law firm that wrote that brief got a special advantage because the federal judge handling their case not only read it, but read it because his clerk was like sweaty and excited showing him this language. And I know it helped them. And so all good lawyering is good storytelling, and good storytelling is good writing, good speaking.
I love that. That should be like the quote at the top of one of your books at some point. Set the vibe. Speaking of good writing, one thing that we noticed about Central Park West is it has a real lived-in quality when it comes to describing not only the place of, southern Manhattan, like the tip of Manhattan, but also, just kind of like the office and, people's walls getting ruined by leaks and stuff. It really kind of lends maybe gritty is the wrong word, but more like realistic view, especially for people who are outsiders and are probably picturing like beautiful oak paneled offices for fancy lawyers. The reality is obviously different. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us about the process of bringing some of your real world experience into this so the writing comes more alive for people?
Yeah, I worked hard to try to make this as real as fiction can be, in that sense, that I want the places and the procedures and the people, although the people are fictional, but the way they act and move and talk to be what I experienced. And then I check myself. Obviously, I have an advantage because I have a daughter who works in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. And when I wrote this, she was on her feet in courtroom 318 prosecuting Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator. And I was forbidden to go because she told me, "Dad, it'll be a thing if you show up." So my daughter banned me, but Patrice got to go. And she gave me secondhand reports. But it was really cool to be able to close my eyes and think about that courtroom, for example, and her office. I had worked in both, walked in both. I tried John Gambino in courtroom 318 when she was a little girl. And so I was able to close my eyes and type and try to bring the reader into that place. And then I had, obviously, Patrice read my work, and then the kids all read my work and checked me and said, actually, Maureen said I had her office on the wrong floor, that I'd missed that they had moved from one floor to another. So I corrected that. But I wanted it to be, the readers wouldn't notice, but I want people, even who have a deep knowledge of these places, not to be able to say, Comey missed this. It's 4 stairs, not 5. And so that was a point of pride for me. And I hope don't think I have offered too much detail. I wanted to offer enough to make it real in the imagination of the readers and accurate because I lived it.
The book focuses on the work of a member of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I think you describe that job as the job of doing good. How would you further describe the role of that office to our audience who may not be super familiar with it?
The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York is one of 94 U.S. Attorney's offices around the country. So it's part of the Department of Justice. And each of those places is led by a presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed leader, the U.S. Attorney, which is a weird quirk because it seems like they're deep underlings of the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, but they have their own authority, almost political, but with a lowercase p by virtue of being nominated and then confirmed by the Senate. But their job is to investigate and prosecute with federal agencies like the FBI, federal crimes, which is anything that Congress says can be prosecuted in federal court. And it leads to all kinds of interesting turf wars because Congress has expanded over the decades the jurisdiction of federal prosecutors to a place where almost anything can be reached in federal court, things that could be prosecuted in state court. And so you'll have friction with the DA's office, between a DA's office and a U.S. Attorney's office, which I try to capture in the book. But their job is to bring cases in front of United States district judges and prosecute them in the federal court system, which is separate in the United States from the state court systems.
You mentioned the Gambino trial, and of course you worked in New York at this job, under Rudy Giuliani, years ago. I'm just curious, can you share with us the most wild experience you've had in the courtroom as a prosecutor in that role?
Yeah, I two things that I try to capture in the book, actually. One is I had a cooperating witness who was one of the world's greatest art thieves. And he went by the nickname Frenchie, which is what I've used in the book. And he was a real guy who really did look like Dennis Leary, the actor, and was incredibly sophisticated when it came to art. He was so good at stealing art. And he would always say, I'm not stealing crap. If I see something on the wall that doesn't look good, I'm not taking it because I know art. So I had him testify against a group of mobsters who were his fences. And he was nervous, but okay. And he walked into the courtroom and one of the mobsters mouthed to him, "You're dead." And I didn't see it, but I watched his face change as he sat down. And he's normally a highly verbal guy. And I had to pull his testimony out of him almost word by word. Something was terribly wrong. And I try to tell that story in the book. And for this, I actually went and got the transcript from that trial. And so the words that are spoken in that part of the book were spoken in real life, that's his testimony. And the things that the prosecutor said were things that I said to the judge then to try to get it real. The second thing that happened in a different mob case is I had a mob hitman stand up during a break and pass me a note that I had gotten a recognition from the Bar Association during this 6-month trial. And the note said, "Mr. Comey, I read of your award. Congratulations, it is well deserved." And then signed his name. And this is a guy who killed people for a living, slipping me this note. And I thought it was, and I still think, even in hindsight, it was an effort to do two things at once. First, to continue to portray himself as a man of honor, or uomo d'onore, and because we are just combatants, right? We are knights from different kingdoms. And so this was consistent with that. And second, I think he was playing with the idea of cooperating, trying to see. I thought it was the opening to a dance. And so I had the character in real life who inspired Benny Dugan, see if he couldn't have a conversation with him. And it didn't go anywhere, but I think that was the move. That's one of the strangest things that's ever happened in my courtroom experience.
Speaking of the character who inspired Benny Dugan, this is a very gripping, involving story. We're not going to get any spoilers because we don't want to distract for the reader, but I'm going to read the last 2 lines of the book. "Finally, I'm grateful to have known and loved Kenneth McCabe, the greatest organized crime investigator this country has ever seen. This is the work of fiction, but I hope his family can feel some of Kenny in these pages. Can you tell us about Kenneth McCabe?
Yeah, Kenny McCabe was, in a way, law enforcement royalty. He grew up in Brooklyn. His father had been the chief organized crime prosecutor in the Brooklyn DA's office. And Kenny came of age and didn't want to be a prosecutor. He wanted to be a cop. And so he joined the NYPD. He became the youngest detective in the history of the department, I think at the age of 23. And he was gifted with an incredible memory and a way of connecting with people that was almost seemed inconsistent with his physical form. He was a gigantic man, about 6'5", 250. And he was then discovered, he worked organized crime, he was discovered by the feds, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York hired him as an investigator. And that's where I came to know him. And everybody in the mob knew Kenny McCabe because of his size and because he relentlessly conducted surveillance. He believed that the key to establishing a conspiracy was to put people together physically. And so he would spend an unbelievable amount of his free time. His kids would say, if they were here, yeah, Dad missed dinners because he was out sitting in this awful, I think it was a Ford Pinto he was driving then, taking pictures of mobsters at wakes, at funerals, at social clubs. And it was work that the FBI didn't do for complicated reasons. It didn't do nearly as much as Kenny did. And so he became this encyclopedic investigator who knew everybody in Cosa Nostra. And there are all kinds of stories to illustrate his connection to Cosa Nostra, but one of my favorites is he was on surveillance one day when a young mobster spit on his car. And Kenny started to get out to confront this guy, but he was interrupted by that mobster's boss grabbing the young mobster and screaming at him for disrespecting Kenny McCabe. Don't you ever do that again. And so Kenny got back in his car and didn't need to say anything. But he was the person that mobsters often reached out to when they wanted to cooperate because they trusted him. I mean, he was a fierce adversary and they knew his goal was to put them in jail for life. But he was never going to lie to them. He was never going to embarrass them. And he also abided their, frankly, BS, notion of honor by doing things like not serving them with subpoenas in front of their family, offering them the opportunity to surrender in a place that didn't have them in handcuffs in front of their neighbors or kids. And so we became very close when I was an assistant U.S. attorney, and then again when I was the U.S. attorney. And when we were working together doing mob cases, he would call me Mr. Smooth. He would say, Mr. Smooth. And that was his way of a backhanded compliment, I guess, of that I was good on my feet. And I would call him Mr. Rough. And he would frequently say, hey, you know, I'm not as good a person as you think I am. And then I would say, we had a shtick, and I would say, what makes you think that I think you're a good person? And so I've tried to capture some of that banter in the relationship between Nora Carlton, the protagonist, and Benny Dugan, the investigator. Kenny McCabe died at the age of 59 of melanoma. And it's just a great tragedy that he's gone. He never got to be a grandfather. He was very close with his family. But I've stayed in touch with his family. And I hope they see, I've had some friends read this who knew him well and say that the spirit of Kenny is in this book. So that's the inspiration for Benny Dugan, a real person. And in that way, that was also easy to write because I could close my eyes and I could hear this deep Brooklyn baritone, see this enormous man who never wore socks, but always had an ankle holster with a gun on his ankle, and hear him talking to me and capture that diction, that pacing.
Yeah, Benny comes off as a real fascinating character. There's I won't go into too many details, but there's like an exciting scene in the book where some law enforcement officers basically want to go in like an army to arrest somebody, and Benny Dugan says, no, that's not the way you do it. And is that the sort of thing that Kenny would do in real life?
Yeah, that was the reality of how he conducted himself. And he did it because, look, he couldn't stand these people. He said he became a police officer and wanted to work organized crime because he hated bullies. Even though he'd been a large person, he had this sense of honor that is just wrong to pick on vulnerable people. And he thought these were the biggest bullies in the world. But he would give them those little gestures of so-called honor because it helped him accomplish the mission. and people came to trust him. Again, like I said, I'm both on the good guy's side and on the bad guy's side.
One thing that kind of comes across in the book is this idea of like the investigative process and sort of people coming together to try to work towards unraveling essentially a mob conspiracy. And I'm wondering, like, what is it like to actually work those kind of prosecutions, and how is that different from some of the other types of cases that you've worked over the years?
First of all, one of the cool things about being a federal prosecutor is that you have an investigative role that's not familiar in most DA's offices. In most state systems, well, this is for your audience, but you all know this, you're experts on this, but in most state systems, the police do the investigating or the sheriffs do the investigating. And I wasn't a football player, but if you imagine a football field, the police carry the ball to the midfield line and then hand it to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor carries it for the rest of the field, ideally in a case that warrants it, to the end zone, which is conviction. And you see that division of labor reflected in places like NYPD, where they clear by arrest, not conviction. And there's all kinds of weaknesses in that system that the federal system tries to address because it has more resources and more time. And what happens in the federal system is the federal prosecutor meets the investigators, say the FBI, pretty close to one end zone. And if FBI agents are on this podcast right now, they'd say, yeah, you bastards are in our end zone trying to take the ball from us. But they run the field together, side by side. And the FBI, a key stat in the FBI is conviction, not arrest. So you clear by conviction to create incentives to pursue a case all the way to the end. And the strength of that is the case is investigated with an eye towards what might happen in the courtroom. And for an agent, it's never open to the prosecutor when you get to the other end of the field to say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Because the prosecutor was there the whole time. What do you mean, why didn't we do that? Why didn't you do that? There's strength in that. And it also makes the job of a federal prosecutor, where that's the norm in the way cases are approached, really interesting. And that was especially the norm in organized crime cases, that when the Bureau wanted to work something, they would come at the very beginning and get a prosecutor assigned to work side by side with an agent or a squad of agents. And so this work, I found the investigative part of it consuming and addictive, because we were together trying to figure out, so how are we going to get at these guys? And what evidence might work? And who should we try to flip? And what surveillance would be useful? And what can we find out? And what digital dust might they have left that will help us figure out who's involved in this conspiracy? And then when you get to try the case, you know the case incredibly well because you investigated it with the agents all the way, which makes for a strong courtroom presentation. So I've tried to capture that. And someone once told me that a lot of successful crime fiction involves cops or prosecutors going rogue in some way. And I haven't portrayed that because I don't need that to tell an exciting story. I mean, it's exciting to do this work, even or especially because you're doing it consistent with the authorities you actually have. You're not breaking the law to try and investigate a case. And you all have dealt with a lot of this. We've seen enough injustice from people going rogue or not doing an investigation well. There's no reason to want to go there anyway.
Yeah, we talked about Patrice's pet peeves. One of my crime fiction pet peeves is when you're thinking like, this guy should be disbarred for doing this, even if it's exciting, or, it gives people also an inaccurate view of what law enforcement is about and indicate, I think it kind of promotes misconceptions.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, so decades of doing this, prosecutors in the main and investigators in the main are, first of all, they're people like me, so flawed. They have all kinds of cognitive biases. They make all kinds of mistakes, but they're trying to do the right thing in the right way. That doesn't mean they don't sometimes end up doing the wrong thing because of the ways our brains work, the way our brains work. And yes, there are prosecutors and investigators who do things wrong and bring shame on the entire profession. But in the main, people are trying to do it using the authorities that they have within the laws that they operate under and trying to do it in the right way. That sounds boring to say that, but it doesn't have to be boring and isn't in real life.
I thought one of the most interesting parts of the book were those scenes where Nora and the other characters were like brainstorming ways to solve problems and to do surveillance and this digital dust thing you speak of. Do you think people have an understanding of how many of their actions are basically being tracked or surveilled in the modern era?
I don't think so. I didn't think this when I was in the FBI, and I still don't. People, not including me, don't realize just how much dust you're leaving, digital dust, in almost everything that you do. And most of that dust is not being gathered by the government. In the first instance, certainly it's being gathered by those who want to sell you stuff. And I remember the FBI saying, again, facetiously, if only we had the investigative capability of, and then I would name a private company that's collecting all kinds of data on all of us. But I don't think we realize that every place we go, we're leaving dust, and that it's available, thank goodness, with the appropriate legal authority to investigators. And that it's a whole nother problem that there isn't those kinds of legal authorities governing the gathering of the dust by private enterprise. But there's a tremendous amount out there. There's no doubt it's true that we live in a golden age of digital surveillance. The flip side, of course, is that we also live in a golden age of criminal communication. Criminals can communicate using encrypted apps and things in ways that were unimaginable 20 years ago. But yeah, I don't think people get. And one of the things I'm trying to show in this book is the power of that dust that's out there. Maybe it's chilling because it's useful when used against a murderer or criminal, but it's out there on all of us.
This reminds me, I was looking at your publisher's Facebook page, and they said that when you were doing a signing the other day, you gave tips on how to spot surveillance. Can you share some of those tips with us?
Oh, I didn't know they'd said that. I was just passing the time. I signed 1,250 books, so I had to talk about something. But yeah, I was telling these young folks who were passing me the books some of the training that the FBI gave to my family, and also that we give to our people, especially they're not my people anymore. Sorry, that the organization gives to its people when it sends them overseas. And so the first lesson is that you must constantly live in yellow. Most people, there are 4 states of existence: white, yellow, orange, and red. Now, red is a fight for your life, hormones coursing. Orange is on the cusp of such a fight. And so neither of those states is sustainable. Most of us choose to live in white. So we have our headphones on, texting, waiting for a bus at midnight, looking down, oblivious to the world. And what the FBI tries to train people like my family is, don't do that. Don't live in a state that's unsustainable. You can't live in an orange state, but live in a state with a healthy awareness of risk and danger. And so when you walk into a place, before you sit down to eat, think about where the exits are. When you stop your car at a red light, stop while you can still see the rear tires of the car in front of you. Always. I've just ruined your driving for you and your listeners, but my family was trained, always be able to see the tires of the car in front of you. Now, why is that? It's very unlikely something bad's going to happen, but if it happens, you have room to pull out of there. If you can't see the tires, you have no room to move and you're trapped. And so the characteristics of a life lived in yellow were preached. We preach to people we send overseas. We preach to my family to learn those things. My family was taught, as we teach FBI people to go overseas, if the road is blocked in front of you, there's some sort of roadblock or obstacle, don't look ahead, look to your side. Because if there's a danger, it's coming to you from the side, not the front. And almost all bad things happen after someone watched first. And so that yellow should mean that you're especially aware when you approach places that you normally go, home, school, work. Just be aware of what's there. And if you see something doesn't make sense, don't write an innocent narrative over it, which is a natural human tendency. You don't want to have your life be governed by the hairs on the back of your neck. But if something doesn't seem right, there's a really good chance it's not. And that you are alive today because your ancestors had that sense. And so when you feel it, walking through a parking lot, standing on a bus platform, listen to that feeling and look around, be aware. So these are the kinds of things I was depressing these young people with while they were passing me the book. And, my kids did well with this. I mean, the FBI actually sent people to follow them on college campuses, for example, to see if they were living in yellow. And They made the surveillance because they saw someone that didn't make sense in a place, or they saw the same person twice in different places. And of course, the innocent narrative you write is, oh, that's just a coincidence. Don't do that. Don't do that. Think to yourselves, wait a minute, what's the guy doing there? And why did I see him at the bookstore? And now I see him at my dorm. That doesn't make any sense. Why do I see that car 3 days in a row? So my advice to these the folks at the bookshop was, live in yellow, try to live a patternless life. Why on earth are you taking the same walk every day at the same time? Why on earth are you running the same route? That just makes it too easy for someone who wants to do something, and very unlikely there is, but why would you take that chance? Change it up, go a different route, be a little random to make yourself safer. There's no such thing as safe, but there's safer. And that's what I meant when I told them about living in yellow.
We need to switch up some things, Kevin. And I also saw on the list was die in the parking lot, don't get into the car, in terms of, I guess.
Yeah, that's my most depressing piece of advice. I was going to leave that one out, but you're right. I mean, my kids have all been taught, don't ever get in a car at the threat of force, and hear my voice. When that happens, there'll be all kinds of hormones, stress hormones pounding through your body. Hear your father saying, don't you dare get in that car. Do everything you can. Fight now, because if you get in that car, I will never see you again. And so listen to me, hear me. And again, it's a terrible thing to tell your children, I suppose, but God forbid they're ever in a parking lot and someone with a knife or a gun, because the tendency is when you're shown a weapon in a circumstance like that, you're like, okay, so the safest thing for me to do is to get in the car so I don't have a violent encounter now. And it's counterintuitive. So you need your big bad father's voice.
Yeah, I mean, and we're a true crime audience, so we're all very paranoid. So I don't worry about depressing anybody. We're used to it. In terms of the book, the storyline is very exciting. And you mentioned some of the sort of rules that the mafia allegedly has around, don't hurt law enforcement or their families, and that topic sort of does come up in the book. And I'm curious, in your experience prosecuting some of these cases, did you ever feel threatened or endangered by the work that you were doing?
Not from Cosa Nostra, because that is, I was saying how their rules are mostly lies. That one they actually abide in the United States Mafia. It's actually the opposite in the Sicilian Mafia. That in the American Mafia, they do not mess with law enforcement. And it's not about valuing our lives or something. It's about self-interest. And if you think about the relationship between the criminal group and the state and compare Sicily to America, you understand why. In Sicily, although it ebbs and flows, but in Sicily over the years, the Cosa Nostra has been more powerful than the state, and so could kill prosecutors and cops with impunity. In the United States, the state is much, much bigger than a New York mafia family. And if you harm law enforcement, law enforcement will deploy everything, right? There are almost 40,000 cops in New York. They will deploy everything to get you. And that was illustrated in a case that I was involved in, although just tangentially. In 1988, a DEA agent named Everett Hatcher was killed by a mob associate named Gus Faraci. And it wasn't even clear that Faraci knew that Hatcher was an undercover agent, but it didn't matter to either law enforcement or the mob, because a chase started with two components. All of us in law enforcement were doing everything we could to find Gus Faraci and bring him to justice. And the mob was trying to find him. And they, fortunately or unfortunately, they found him first. And he thought he was moving from a car into a van that would take him to a safe place. And the van door opened and he was killed by a hail of machine gun fire. And the assailants got out and then shot him in the face with the machine gun, which is a ultimate disgrace in Cosa Nostra. You can't have an open casket. And so they found him first and then ended it, trying to send a message to law enforcement that this was unauthorized, it will not be tolerated. And so the reason that they do that, again, is they fear the state. It's very, very bad for business to have a war with American law enforcement. So I never actually got any threats from Cosa Nostra. I worried more about the people too stupid to realize that if you harmed me, there were thousands of people like me who would just take the job. And so there were threats in my career. I used to get greeting cards to me from a guy I'd sent to jail saying, I hope you and your family stay healthy so you're around when I get out of prison, that kind of thing. Just a moron, but too stupid to know that it makes no sense to try to threaten me because I'm just a single person in a gigantic system. But to the mob, they really did abide that, which is good. I mean, I like it when they're not going to harm law enforcement.
What are some of the special or unique challenges that come up when you're prosecuting a mob case?
Primary challenge is protecting witnesses and the jury, because Cosa Nostra is made up of some scary people, but in a way their reputation is scarier than the reality. And that matters because in a witness's mind, the fear of retaliation could shape their testimony. And one of the great tools that the American law enforcement community has that our colleagues in Sicily and Italy did not and still don't is the witness security program, WITSEC, where we could promise someone, if you cooperate, we will keep you and your family safe. We will hide you in America. Now that's become harder and harder in the digital age because of all that dust that we all leave around, but very difficult in Sicily, for example, to tell a pentiti, someone who wants to cooperate, that will hide you because they're thinking, where, right? Another village in Sicily? Or, right, take me to Naples, I'll stick out like a sore thumb, right? Take me to Milan, everyone will know I'm from Sicily. It'll be obvious. And the cool thing about America is we are such a mixing pot that we can hide people in places where they won't be found, despite some of their idiocies. In the Gambino case, had a mob witness who was relocated by the United States Marshals in WITSEC, and I didn't know where he was. But he told me the story about how he'd opened an Italian restaurant, and his name was Vincent DeMarco. He went by Vinny, and he had been given an entirely new name. And he opened this Italian restaurant in wherever he was, in Middle America, and in gigantic fluorescent letters, neon letters, he put Vinny's over the top. And his handler from the Marshal Service came by to check on him, as they do, and said, hey, sign's got to go. And Vinny said something like, well, it's not my name. My name's John. He's like, Vinny, stop. Anybody with a connection to Cosa Nostra comes into this place. They glance at you, handing out menus. They look up at the sign. We're done. The sign goes. And so he was very, very unhappy about that. He was also unhappy that they wouldn't let him get married twice. He was already married in his real life, and his wife thought he was a turncoat by cooperating against the mob. And so she refused to go in the program with him. And he met a lovely person in the program and got married. And when I talked to him about that, I said, Vinny, you're already married. And he said, no, that's the old me. I said, you're a single human being, Vinny. You cannot, bigamy is unlawful in all 50 states. You cannot be married twice. And so we had to get a lawyer to arrange for a secret divorce so that Vinny was not in violation of the law when he testified against the Gambino brothers.
I feel like I want to watch that rom-com, though, I'm going to say.
There's a question I'm going to shoehorn in here, and my justification is that Nora is from Hoboken. The most famous person from Hoboken, of course, is Frank Sinatra. And I just wondered, did his name come up in any of your work prosecuting the mob?
It did, but only tangentially, because there was the Gambino brothers, who I prosecuted, had been very prominent in supporting the actor who plays the Frank Sinatra character in The Godfather, Johnny Fontaine. And that's a real person, an Italian-American singer, who after he played that role had a really hard time getting jobs because Cosa Nostra didn't like it that this guy had played the Frank Sinatra character. And so I've actually listened to wiretap tapes and bug tapes where the Gambino brothers were talking about the problems they had, and I'm forgetting the real life actor's name, but the problems they had. They'd spent so much money helping him with his career, and now they had this problem because of the hangover from the Godfather fake Sinatra role. But that's the only way in which it came up.
Kevin's a huge Sinatra fan, so we were very intrigued when we saw that on newspapers.com.
I have nothing bad against him.
Yeah. In terms of the Gambino trial, I'm curious, you mentioned that, and it was, a very, very important case, especially in New York, got a lot of media coverage. How else has that experience shaped your work, and just kind of any interesting memories that you have from that whole thing?
Well, I spent 6 months on trial in that case, which was really hard on Patrice. We had 2 little kids. We were living in a 2-family house in Maplewood, New Jersey, which is also captured in the book. We moved there from Hoboken, where I lived. And so that the burden on my family was tremendous. I learned in that case some of the tools that helped me later in my career about dealing with stress and about taking care of myself and about the importance of sleep. As boring as that sounds, that became a real big part of my life when I worried about the FBI people running themselves down. I spent a tremendous amount of time with people who had killed a lot of people. And for example, in the middle of the Gambino trial, so 6-month trial, the Italian National Police reached out and said that they had a new cooperator, Pentiti, the name of Gaspare Mutolo, who had been a made member of Sicilian Cosa Nostra and had been an assassin for Cosa Nostra. And he had come into their custody and he wanted to cooperate. And they understood from his debriefings that he knew our defendants and could testify about meeting with them and things they had done connecting to the drug trade. And so my partner and I, Pat Fitzgerald, trial partner, and I, and an FBI agent flew on the weekend to Rome, and the Italian National Police took us to a convent outside of Rome, and it was like a scene out of a movie. The convent was empty except for Mutolo and Italian National Police officers staying with him. And the gate was broken or something, and so there were 2 cars pulled in front of the gate with guys with shotguns, and they backed the cars out, and we drove in, and I spent the weekend with Gaspare Mutolo, and he made pasta for us. He cooked pasta for us and served us espresso and cappuccino. And we sat and talked about his life of crime. And the reason we wanted to have this conversation is to find out what did he know, but we also want to know what acts of violence he had committed, because it might be too much for an American jury. And he told us that weekend that he had killed 37 human beings. And it turned out he never killed anyone in law enforcement, thank goodness. He never killed what you would consider an innocent. The people he killed were all Cosa Nostra soldiers. He was part of a big war. And it turned out his number was wrong, because when we brought him to the U.S. to testify, it turned out he'd killed 38, because he remembered literally on the witness stand in courtroom 318 that there was a second guy named Pino D'Amico that he had also killed. So there were 2 Pino D'Amicos. So the count went up to 38. And the reason I'm telling this story is it's a really weird thing to sit and eat delicious pasta carbonara made by a mass murderer and realize that the light's not changing when I'm in his presence, that he doesn't look any different than anybody else you might have pasta with. And it's another thing that led me to, my kids would groan at this, but if you grew up in my household, you know the following expression: evil has an ordinary face. And bells don't ring, lighting isn't dimmed. And I talked a lot to him and to other witnesses about killing other human beings. And they all said the same thing. The first time, very, very hard. After that, not so much. And when you got up to 35, 37, turns out 38, it was just a job that he did. And so seeing humanity in that way was real, stayed with me, it still stays with me. I can picture it as I tell his story. And a reminder of that people are complex and that there really aren't any purely evil people or purely good people, that everyone is a mix. Now, in his case, he was a mix, a lot of the dark side, but he considered himself to have lived a life of meaning. I was a soldier. I chose this life out of my village. It's how I fed my family. I made promises to abide the orders in this organization, and my bosses told me to kill these people who were themselves soldiers and who knew what this life involved. And so I was living a certain life, and it's a life of meaning and order. And you may not understand it, but that's how I see it. And hearing that and thinking, there's some logic to that is unsettling and also a great learning experience for me. And I'll shut up in a second, but the FBI flew him to testify and got him out from the airport in a blacked out van, brought him to the courthouse, put him on the stand, and then they were bringing him back out through one of the walk bridges that I talk about in the novel. And he said through an interpreter, I've never seen America. May I see America before I return? So they took him up to the roof of the courthouse, walked out onto the roof, said, all right, you got 3 minutes. There's America. So he looked around Lower Manhattan. I don't know whether he could see the Statue of Liberty from there. He saw America. They took him, put him back in the blacked out van, put him on the FBI jet, and returned him to the convent in Italy. End of story.
That's an incredible story. And it also makes me think, in the book, you create such a real and involving and fascinating world, a world where stories like that happen, that as a reader, it's difficult to leave that world when you have to put the book down and when it's over. And in real life, you were part of that world and you did leave it. Do you miss operating in that world and doing that sort of work?
I do. I found it, it's a weird word to use. I found it really fun. But it wasn't for me, given my life circumstances, sustainable in the long run. It's very, very hard to be an investigator and trial lawyer like that, and also be a good spouse and parent. And so I was glad I got to do that for 6 years the first time. I never thought I'd go back. Finally kept my promise to my Iowa and Virginia born and raised wife to leave. And then I went back after 9/11 through total accident and loved it both times. But it's very difficult on someone's family. So I also think it's also a young person's game. I'm in reasonably good shape, but it's very, very hard on you physically to do that in the long run.
And now, of course, you've become a novelist. What's it been like to become a novelist and start going to events like the Edgar Awards, start meeting other writers like Scott Turow? What's it been like to enter this new world?
It's a big change because another writer described himself this way, and it applies to me. He said, I'm a socially adept introvert, and I can do events, I can give speeches, I can go around and shake hands with FBI employees by the thousands. But when I'm done, I need to go sit and look out at a tree and just stare at the tree for a long time, because I don't get energy from those kinds of interactions. They're not bad, but it's just my personality type, and everybody's different in that way. And so in a way, the pandemic and being a fiction author is consistent with my personality and maybe is dangerous for me because I need to get out. And my world, I don't want my world to shrink too much. So going to the Edgar Awards was the first, and not just pandemic-wise, but the first engagement of any significant number of people I've been at a long time. And I'm glad that I did it because I'm seeing a culture that I know nothing about. I mean, I'm looking around realizing I don't know the people, I don't know their traditions, I don't know the backstories, I don't know the culture. Same way they would feel if they came to an FBI alumni gathering or something. And so I found it fascinating. The cocktail party is always the hardest part for me. It's going to sound like I'm making this up, but I am a giraffe, so I'm really tall. I cannot hear at cocktail parties. And so I do a weird thing where I spread my feet to lower myself down so I can hear people. But it's uniquely difficult to hear in the 2 or 3 feet above most conversation at a cocktail party. And so that's the hardest part for me. And I have no problem with my hearing. I think it's a height-related issue. But once you get to the table, I'm able to just watch, and I don't have to do anything. I have no speaking role. That's a lot of fun. I don't know how the book events will be, because when I wrote there was no tour for my second nonfiction book because it was the pandemic. The first one, the tour was all in big theaters, like gigantic venues. And so I actually didn't sign books. And so now I'll get to interact with people on a much more personal basis. And I think I'll both find it fun and I'll need to go stare at a tree.
We really loved the book. We found the characters in the world very engaging. And forgive us for asking, but are we going to get a chance to read more about these characters in this world?
You are. I've already written the second book involving Nora and Benny, and it's now out. I have circles of pitiless proofreaders and critics, my wife, my 5 children. It's out now with the next circle, which are my friends who delight in brutalizing me and who know the world. So yes, there's another book coming. And if this works, I hope there'll be many books.
Well, we certainly hope to have you back on once those new books come out. Especially, I'm very excited. I'm very excited to see Nora and Benny again. Also very excited for Richmond and Williamsburg for obvious reasons.
Well, it's a treat. And thanks for having me, because you all do a lot of good work. And so thank you for that. And hope you'll have me back.
Definitely.
We would love
Thank you
that.
so much.
Thank you so much. It was really great talking to you again. And we really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Oh, sure. It's great. It's great to meet you. It's great to see you again.
Yeah.
I'll see you on down the road.
Exactly. We'll get back together soon. All right. Well, thank you so much. Great talking.
Okay. All right. Be well. Bye.
Bye. We'd like to thank Jim Comey again for taking the time to talk with us.
We know we said this a few times in the interview, but his new novel, Central Park West, really is a terrific read. You can find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. We'll also include a link in our show notes. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen, but HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky. And I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code MSHEET16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for listening.